But Marilynne Robinson is a novelist. She's principally a fiction writer. And I will tell you right off the bat, I have not read her fiction. This is something you should probably know about me, everybody. I don't like fiction. I'm not good with fiction. I like nonfiction. I keep trying to read novels. I don't really get anywhere with them. So I don't know. But I like her very much. And she has written at least 2 collections of essays. The essay that I had you read today is from a book called The Death of God. Sorry, The Death of Adam. Excuse me, Death of Adam. And it's a collection of essays on a variety of topics, largely pertain to religion, but not exclusively. And then for next week, I'm having you read 2 essays from a collection of essays called Givenness, which is also quite beautiful. If you do find that you like her, then I would highly recommend you take a look at her fiction. That is, provided you like fiction too. Like I mentioned, she's alive. She's contemporary. She's writing. And I do know that President Obama likes her very much. They have had some significant correspondence. In fact, I think in the other book, he wrote the introduction or the foreword, but maybe not in this one. So anyway, so there we have it. I'm going to turn it over and see what you all thought. How did you guys find this reading? Anybody want to share their general impressions?
I posted my response kind of late, so you probably did not see it, but I thought it was very refreshing to kind of hear, I don't know, because I am so bad at interpreting tones in books, so I have no idea if I interpret this right, but it was very nice to read a book that wasn't like, I am man, hear me roar, because I'm like, I'm sick of that. Like, can't you just like admit that we're just monkey? Like, grow up, you know? And she was kind of like obvious about, like, she was like, yeah, Darwin was kind of nasty. And he's nasty just like Ape Monkey. We are all Ape Monkey. So I was kind of into that. It did make me think about like what I wish I could say to Darwin, which is very funny. And also it made me think about how elephants have religion.
All right. Hang on to that last thought. I don't have the mind capacity to deal with that one yet. So
they have religion, dude. Wake up.
One at a time. All right. Thank you, Finn. Zach.
Yeah, I thought it was really an interesting reading. I'm not sure where it sits in with like the history of Darwinism being debunked as like a social ideology. Like, I don't know, like, was this one of the first like times this was noted, or like was this something that had been being talked about? Because I don't know, I think it's really, you know, it's interesting, or not interesting, it's important for people to know that it wasn't just purely like a scientific theory. Like, it was kind of driven by certain like social ideas about like well, you know, racism. It was driven by racism. And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this critique has been around for a while. It's been known, maybe not prominently blared or prominently appreciated. I'm sorry, right. Zach, I cut you off. Go ahead.
No, I was wondering like where this, I just wanted to bring it back to like, I was wondering where this kind of sits in with the chronology of Darwinism being debunked, basically.
Well, I know that the Darwinists, you know, they will strenuously deny that they have anything to do with social Darwinism, but at the very least, I think that reveals that they are sensitive to the charge because they know that it's kind of a heavy one, but she does a very good job, I think, of pointing to a pretty undeniable connection here, you know. So I just go back to what I said, Zach. I think it's been known for a long time. She doesn't quote any like hidden or esoteric sources. It's all pretty well known stuff. Malthus and Arnold, and she mentions the full title of The Origin of the Species. I mean, that stuff is not secret, you know. It's if you pay attention, or if you know, look for it, I guess, or don't deny it. I guess more interesting point is, Zach, is how how this social Darwinist link has successfully been washed or erased. That's the more interesting question.
Mm.
Chris?
Yeah, I found this like,
I'm so silly. I just tapped your picture on my screen because I think I'm pointing at you and you can see me pointing at you. Sorry. Go, Chris.
yeah, I mean, I found this reading, like, I think part of what I really liked about it was it feels like there was like a love of humanity and like a lot of like just feeling like compassion and empathy for like humanity, as opposed to like, previous readings where it really just feels like, there's like this little old guy just like typing away on his computer, being like, and this is why you suck, you know? And like, I mean, also because like, I mean, I don't know. Like last time I talked about Darwin was like what, ninth grade biology. So like I didn't know that, like I really thought he was just like some dude just like messing around, going to like Galapagos and whatever, and like playing with Punnett squares, whatever. And yeah, and like finding out all this stuff, and it's, like it reminds me of like, like we talk about religion being used as a tool of violence for that, but also like the way that on the other hand science can do that as well, and the way that, Darwinism basically led to like justification of colonialism and like the evolution of eugenics and all that. And I thought that was a really important point that she made in her writing there.
Awesome. Thank you. And now the birthday boy wants to weigh in.
Honestly, I heard of Darwinism, but never learned about it. So this is actually like my first like real reading about Darwinism, and I found it very it was actually really interesting because like it was all about like how we always like want to change or like evolving, and it just shocked me and like so true that when she talked about how the bigger nation always wants to consume the smaller nation, I was like, damn, that is so true. That just yeah.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad you guys had that reaction. Anybody else want to chime in? You guys mentioned all the reasons that I like this reading, and that I wanted to share with you. Oh yes, Natan, go for it.
Such a side note, but also might be a little embarrassing. But I do know Darwinism from one game that I played. It's called the Darwin Project. It's just about you trying to kill everyone else. But yeah, the Darwin game.
Terrible, right?
Yeah.
Well, this idea, it's funny now that I'm reflecting on what I said to Zach a minute ago, and Darwinism has not exactly scrubbed its name and reputation of all nasty implications, right? Because there is the word Darwinian, right? We use the word Darwinian, and that can have a pejorative connotation, a dark connotation to it. And that's what, and her point largely is that, let's think on that. Let's reflect on that. Let's realize what that means. But the more important point is that, Darwinism is a theology of its own, she says, and it is wrought with moral judgments as well, right? It purports to be a science. Dennett and Dawkins purport to be scientists. They claim to be scientists and they are objective, but it is laden with judgment, with value judgment throughout, right? So that's the bulk of her claim. And it's also very telling that she opens here with a pretty profound criticism of capitalism, which you'll see quite a bit. She is what we would describe as a social justice Christian. And interestingly, she sees the development of capitalism and Darwinism as hand in hand. And reflecting on the history of it this morning, I was thinking she may have a point. The Industrial Revolution in England is the late 1700s, early 1800s. Capitalism is really starting to rev up, as is imperialism. And her argument is ultimately going to be that Darwinism was a reaction, not principally to the Christian God, but to Christian ethics. And certainly Christian ethics stand in the way. If science is atheistic. Capitalism certainly is, right? So anyway, I saw a hand. Did someone want to speak up? No? Okay. Oh, yes, go.
Yeah, I mean, okay. I think you like sort of like touched on what I was thinking here, but like bottom of page 39, top of page 40, where she talks about how like the Darwinist position has been like taken up by the irreligious right as opposed to like the religious right going towards creationism.
Hmm.
And like the way that top of page 40 where it's like their politics and economics align themselves quite precisely with those of their adversaries who yearn to disburden themselves of the weak and to unshackle the great creative forces of competition. And so like the way that they kind of are like, you know, two sides of the same coin almost, I guess, in a way. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Sure. Good. Right. Good. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's lay down. I think you're right, Chris. But I'm going to build up to that. I think we should lay down the groundwork of a couple things before we get there. So how about? So first of all, she distinguishes between Darwinism and evolution. That's one of the early distinctions we get, which is surprising because you probably have, Darwin and Dawkins and Dennett definitely conflate the two, and we probably have been inclined to conflate the two, but she distinguishes them. Why does she distinguish Darwinism from evolution? M.
Hi. Yeah, I think she's distinguishing them as like someone mentioned like social Darwinism, because Darwinian theory has a lot of social things behind it. It's not all scientific, and evolution is more of like this scientific theory of how species have evolved on the planet, where Darwinism is like we're all competitive, and like that makes it okay if we are really shitty to other human beings because it's just natural selection and things like that.
Excellent. Thank you. Anybody else want to chime in? How old is evolution theory? What does she reveal about that? Is it born with Darwin? Yes, Irish is right. It's much older. She doesn't get into too many specifics, but I mean, peoples of the earth have been discovering fossils for centuries. And so there were hypotheses about evolutionary theory from very early on. The other thing she points out is that Darwinism then being Darwin's appropriation of and elaboration of evolutionary theory, right? Where he infused it with certain value judgments unwittingly. And Darwinism comes to be at odds with religion. But her contention early on is that evolutionary theory is not. It does not have to be. Okay, that's the other point. This is all around page 31. The main, the main claim of Darwinism is this phrase you would have all heard: survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest. This is the central claim. What does this mean? How do you explain, or how do you define this? How does Darwin define this term, this saying? Zach?
It's basically just the like primary idea of natural selection, that like the organism with the traits that are most conducive to its survival will be the organism that passes on the genes for those traits, so that future generations are more likely to have the same trait.
Awesome. Sunny.
Oh yeah, just agree with what Zachary said. It's just that I find it interesting that she noted that it might be a tautological kind of definition, because if survival of the fittest is true, that means all who have survived are fit, and so it doesn't really explain much.
Good. Natan.
Yeah, I also agree with Zachary. Zach, like he said it the way, like I think that's like the perfect example. I'll just say my like go-to think of it as only the strong survive. It's
Yeah.
very blunt, but yeah, if you ain't strong, you're gonna die.
Good.
Right,
Yeah.
huh?
Only the strong business. I mean, it was kind of wasn't exactly fair of me to ask y'all to define it, because it's intended to be self-explanatory, really. You know, only the survival of the fittest. You know, those who are strongest make it. And she critiques that in the way that Sunny points out that it is a tautology. A tautology. God, I haven't taught logic in years. I mean, a tautology is a statement that reaffirms something and doesn't really say anything new. Here's an example of a tautology. Blue is blue. That's a tautology. Well, thanks for the news, right? Thanks for the information. Survival of the fittest. Well, fuck yeah. If they're the fittest, they happen to have survived, right? So it doesn't really teach us anything. And so that's kind of strange. She has something else interesting to tell us about the victorious traits. What else does she have to tell us? She has another interesting critique about, these traits. The Darwinians take for granted that survival of the fittest, that's easy to see and is obvious to discern, but maybe not, right? These traits may not be so victorious after all. Know what I mean? What else does she point out about the quote unquote survival of the fittest? You know what I mean? Who's at the top of this chain? The most complex creatures. That would be me, obviously. I'm at the top. You all are somewhere in the middle. You'll get there. Humans are the most complex. How fit are we? I'm very fit, actually. I started working out with a physical trainer. But I mean, in general, this humans, right? Rebecca, do you know what I'm getting at here?
I'm not sure. I was actually going to bring up something maybe slightly unrelated in that, like she was talking about how it seems like social Darwinism is like a justification for capitalism and competition. Like, oh, well, if you can't survive capitalism, it's just because you're not like strong enough to survive it.
Good. Oh, Zach.
Yeah, she also mentions how like there's probably like origins among like people in like England in the like after the Industrial Revolution that are starting to kind of get tired of religious doctrines of like care of others and things like that, and like charity to the poor specifically. Like she talks about the example of like someone who just kind of doesn't want to give money or food or something to a homeless person, but like so like uses Darwinism as sort of a justification to say like, hey, like if they, obviously if they weren't fit enough to survive in our society, then they should die off, like using it as a justification for moral kind of, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but just like ignorance, I guess.
Good. One of the more interesting discussions, and it's really a debate, is whether she, the Darwinists, they might deny that they are talking about progress, right? And yet evolution suggests progress, right? There's an interesting point where this comes up where she deals with this in turn. She says, look, y'all, this is on page 45, said to the Darwinists, look, y'all are talking about, you distinguish between simple creatures and complex creatures. And you suggest that, there's an evolution from simple to complex. A couple things. First of all, notice that the amoeba, notice that amoeba is a total stud. That amoeba has stuck it out and hung around. So pretty damn fit, if you ask me, right? The insinuation means the simplicity does not lend itself to fitness. But how about complexity? We're very complex, right? We're possibly the most complex creatures that we've discovered so far until the aliens show up. But this is what she says on page 32. The fittest traits might be the broad path to extinction. The fittest traits, such as we exhibit, might be the broad path to extinction, which means don't take for granted that they're synonymous with success, right? What looks to be fitness now might not be, right? Let's talk about this in the context of human beings. The fittest traits might be the broad path to extinction. Zach?
Yeah, I think one thing that is important to note when saying that is that the traits that are beneficial to an individual's survival might not be traits that are beneficial to the species' survival. So for example, traits that allow someone like a human to survive in a capitalist society where they have to be working constantly and are always stressed out about money and things like that. The traits that lead to economic success in that sense might not, in the long term, lead to the species proliferation, just like as an example.
Awesome. And you hit on another interesting tension, she notes, the tension between social success or success of a species and success and the selfish success of an individual. The Darwinists are excellent at arguing for selfish success, but they're not quite so effective at explaining social success. Finn?
Oh yeah, I was just gonna bring up, Zach said earlier about how like the whole thing where people were like, I don't have to give money to homeless people. I need to eat bread myself, like stuff like that. That's not teamwork. That's not teamwork. You're a little selfish. You know what I mean? And I think that's really what the takeaway of that is to me, like the fittest traits. Like, look at my big muscles, okay, but like, are your big muscles gonna stop the US from nuking? Like, you know what I mean? It's like these preconceived trait, I think that those are hereditary, like if you're raised by parents who aren't giving, who aren't charitable, who believe in war, who are maybe like a military family or maybe a super religious family or things like that to promote those ideas, or Darwinist family, who cares, those are going to be passed on in the same way physical traits are, and that kind of spells doom, I believe, for a lot of morality-based evolution.
Awesome. Thank you. Raven?
I think scientists nowadays no longer call evolution progress because one feature of behavior and fits to a particular environment may not work well in another one. So if you put one creature into some other places, they may just die out or become weaker. But social Darwinists still using the old concept of evolution to justify their idea of competition. So I think that's a problem.
Excellent. Yeah, good point. I think she recognizes that the Darwinists are trying to wriggle free of that notion of progress, but I think it's still hard for them to completely liberate themselves. I think they're still implicated by it. But thank you. Arthur.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like the traits that, humans use to survive are different than, your typical animal these days, and that, we're not blending into the environment or like hunting and killing each other in most places. And so, when it comes to like what is that desirable, it's like, well, obviously like wealthy people, right? But and a lot of those people are like destroying the environment and stuff like that. And it's like, well, if you don't take care of your resources, like where you get your resources, then you're bound to fail. Like if you watch a lot of like David Attenborough's documentaries, like his animal ones are so beautiful. But he talks about like how we're taking up stuff in the ocean, like our kelp forests are dying, and that means all the species are dying, and that means the food chain's dying. Like it all, if you don't take care of it, then you're doomed.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Chris.
Oh, yeah, like I really liked what I think it was Zach what he said about like in the way that we live in a capitalist society. And it just got me thinking about like stuff like generational trauma and how like, a lot of people who descend from, like groups that may have been through like, serious trauma like that, like how their descendants like carry on these traits, which now, no longer serve to protect us, but in terms do us harm. Yeah, that's what I was thinking right now.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. And Raven.
And also, Robinson mentioned altruism in her book. It's like, yeah, it's also animals help each other in their group, and this is better for them to survive. And also, humans, they develop their early tribes and come into different kind of society. This is a real progress because humans can cooperate, humans can respect each other to reduce conflicts. And that's something that social Darwinism and the Darwinists really don't understand about the nature. Nature is not only about competition, but also cooperate and help each other.
Yes. Well, we'll deal with, I think yeah. You're talking about how the selfishness and the social sense, how they interweave, right? You mean how Raven, you're talking about how the evolutionary biologists try to account for a social feeling?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's something always ignored by the Darwinism.
Yes. Love, right? She talks about love. Before we get there though, thank you for all the comments. Let me relay that to a point that she is going to make here, which is, I believe Arthur largely got at the most directly at the critique she wants to point out here. Listen, humans don't exactly fit in the narrative of evolution. That's her point. How so? We brought the Earth to the brink of extinction. How fit are we? Right? Seems to be a pretty major fucking contradiction. So what do we do with that? Well, I mean, that's just a major rebuttal for her, right? That's another reason we should really doubt the accuracy of this theory. And this is a recurring theme that you guys have noticed throughout, that, one way in which humans are exceptional, well, there's, one of the ways is that we're incredibly cruel. Is there any species on Earth that is as cruel as we are? I'm a little bit of a sicko, and I'm really interested in like medieval torture stuff. And YouTube has figured this out. So I'm always getting videos about this story. When I was a kid, went to Belgium, and there was a castle near my dad's hometown that had a torture museum, and I was always intrigued. And Jesus Christ, some of these devices that humans have come up with, You know, I was reading fiction recently. I was reading Steinbeck's Cannery Row, and he has this really in-depth description of a cat catching a mouse. You've ever seen this? Like, a cat doesn't really kill a mouse right away. The cat likes to play with it. And he made it sound pretty bad. And then I watched one of my torture videos. I was like, oh, that's nothing like us. We're far worse. Humans we're the pits. Besides the fact that we're so greedy and improvident and imprudent, that we're bringing all of society to the brink of destruction through climate change. It's really quite remarkable, you know. Good. I think I've upset some people who think I'm into torture videos. I'm pretty tame, y'all. It's no big deal. Irish.
And I also it was interesting because she mentioned how we are cruel, but she also says that we acknowledge our cruelty. And that was like the part where that hits me, because we know that we're cruel, but we don't do anything about it.
Well, actually, it's a different word. It's not. Go ahead, Irish.
Oh, no, you can go.
I was going to say it's not acknowledge.
Oh, yeah.
It's justify. Here's the problem. Darwinism justifies that violence. And that's what's so chilling, right? So let's talk about Malthus, because she thinks this is where the story begins. Malthus, there were two guys, Malthus and Ricardo. She doesn't mention Ricardo, but they were two, I believe they were Scottish thinkers, late 1700s, early 1800s. And at the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution, suddenly the powers that be got very worried, because we started to see a population boom, and yet industry and farming were not efficient enough to feed them all. And so there was this fear that there would be a population boom and then mass starvation. So what does Malthus do? He says, there are people within that. There's a quote on page 33: unfavorable genetic variations deserve to die. Unfavorable genetic variations deserve to die. And he's thinking of the poor. There is a conversation in the chat about dolphins, whales, and orcas that kind of distracted me while I'm talking about unfavorable genetic variations. But anyway, and then immediately, as soon as he uttered this phrase, the powers that be decided they were going to adopt this and apply it to British imperialism, right? This seemed to serve the politics of the British Empire really well. And Darwin was also impressed by it, right? This is on page 33. He quotes it. He quotes Malthus, right? And so that's pretty damning. And then she explains how Darwin's Malthusian influence in turn impressed the British Empire. In the middle of 34, a more populous country implies for him one in which there's more severe attrition, right? The early imperialists, they were going to defend why Britain should, run the world and send their colonists all over the world to run it, because Britain was a really, industrial Britain was a severely competitive and tense and difficult and awful place. Read you all read Dickens back in middle school and high school, I hope, and Dickens depicted how bad it was, right? What Darwin saw, thanks to Malthus, was an environment ripe for competition, which produced the fittest of the fittest, right? A more populous country implies for him one in which there's more severe attrition, therefore more highly evolved people. Because of his competition, the British were more highly evolved. That is to say, success depends not on numbers, but on the severity of the competition. That is a presumed consequence of large population. Brutal conditions at home legitimize domination abroad. Surely this is the worst of all possible worlds. But my point here is that the idea of progressive evolution through natural selection occurred to Darwin as a consequence of reading about endemic starvation in the populations of wealthy countries. That is Malthus. He elaborated it into a theory of national aggression. Natural aggression becomes a theory of national aggression at the imperial level. She also complains that, this is a quote on page 35. She says that mind is not a consideration for Darwin. Mind is not a consideration for Darwin. Why does she say that? What does that mean? Zach.
Well, I know that he basically talks about how in like disposition, or like in other words like mentally, people of different races are all like pretty similar in demeanor. And so but he still stands by the idea that there's like a hierarchy like that is basically based on similarity to Caucasian, Europeans, and similarity, on the other end of the spectrum, according to him, similarity to like apes, because like that's the literal language that he's using. So even though he's able to enforce that like the minds are pretty similar, he still believes that there's a hierarchy.
Yes. And what is the mark of that hierarchy is the question, right? If it's not mind, what is it? Arthur?
Well, she talks about like this dichotomy between like science and religion, as we've, talked about. And how like, these people in the scientific corner tend to try to like logic their way through like religious reasoning and stuff. But the point is like our minds and our beliefs like often don't have an answer, or like don't have, scientific logic attached to them. So it's like you can't like just kind of lump everything together, everything's like very much in the gray area when it comes to like how we perceive and view our worlds.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Sunny.
Oh yeah, she does note on page 35 that Darwinists tend to kind of ignore the mind because they discount it as an anomaly or a delusion because it doesn't really fit into the evolutional narrative.
Good. Irish?
To add to what Sunny said, she also like mentioned how we are like the only ones capable of thinking. So that doesn't like, we think we're the only ones capable of thinking, so it's not part of the order.
Good. It's not, I'll take together what you guys all said. Mind is not the distinguishing feature of our fitness. Mind is not the proof of our fitness, oddly. What is? Success. What ensures success? She cites the example of Tasmania. Oops, someone was speaking up there. Who was it? Out yourself.
Oh, sorry, that was me. I said.
Go for it.
No, never mind. It's not it. Wait, she said something about Darwin freely concedes to the savages courage, loyalty, and affection. Maybe no, that's wrong.
But not mind. He ascribes to the savage people's courage and loyalty, which dogs can possess, but he doesn't ascribe to the mind. She relates this to an example about Tasmania. Tasmania is that island off the coast of Australia, and she gives a pretty chilling example of Tasmania and its colonization, how that fits with Darwin's theory. What is her point about Tasmania? What happened in Tasmania? Extermination of who? By whom? Chris?
the native people of Tasmania to European settlers.
And is that, and her question is this a sign of fitness? What does this indicate about fitness? And what enabled the Europeans to do this? Cruelty, greed, arms. How about mind? Not part of the story, right? Not part of the story at all. So, and there are numerous examples of this around the world, of course, right? Where the imperialists and the Europeans and the colonists, they overcame. But did they overcome? Did they rise to the top by what means, right? By pure cruelty in many cases and greed. And that does not send, that does not send the most positive picture of a Darwinian worldview. It's a chilling. But I think more troubling is greed and violence are more reliably predictors of destruction, and extermination of the earth than the key to success, right? So highly problematic, to say the least. Let me pause there for a second, see if anybody has any any questions or comments they want to raise at this point. Anybody have any problems with her argument so far as it's being laid out, or any questions? Yes, Sunny.
Yeah, now that I think about it again, it is somewhat a little contradictory. The imperialists and the people who destroy indigenous peoples, they did so by cruelty, apathy, and the use of arms. But the thing is that those arms were probably created by the mind. So it is a bit of a paradox there.
It is a paradox. I mean, it's a very old paradox. You've opened the door to an amazing question, which is really one of the oldest philosophical questions. I was thinking about wading into it today, so you kind of opened the door. But what are we to make of technology? Is technology a sign of progress? Or is it not? In the 1700s, Rousseau writes a second discourse where he argues that, technology can be an encumbrance, And he's the opposite of a progressive. He sees regression thanks to progress. Sunny, did you have your hand up still? No, not really. Yes, Arthur. That's one way of thinking about it. Do you want to give an example?
Sure. I mean, I guess in an archaic sense, we can't I don't know how to navigate by stars, I can't even use a map, I've used GPS my whole life. I don't know what I'm doing. Which I don't think that's bad necessarily in that case, because it's this is a helpful thing. Now I can use my brain for other stuff. But I feel in some cases when it comes to certain, I guess as an art student, I'm certain our like methods are kind of drowning now with certain technology, like hand-drawn animation is like rarely done anymore, and I think that's, you know, something worth keeping. So I don't know.
Yeah, good. You kind of speak to Rousseau's fear. Uh, Rousseau famously says that if you take a modern human being, you know, he was talking about a French, like you take a modern Frenchman from society and you pit him against his earlier original self running wild in the nature. He's, you know, if you put them together in battle, the civilized person doesn't stand a chance. And the reason we don't stand a chance is because, like Arthur said, we don't know how to navigate the stars. And I can't sleep outside. Are you kidding me? If you tell me to go out in the woods and find food, ain't gonna happen. I need a 7-Eleven, you know. I'm profoundly weak in many ways. And yet technology is so often taken for granted as a sign of progress. This reminds me of the opening quote here, where she says, you know, she talks about, you know, this is a second sentence, the stripping away of human constraints to liberate great natural forces such as capital flow or the free market has acquired such heady momentum that no one even pauses to wonder whether such forces are indeed particularly natural. What we take for granted as progress, we don't really think of, we don't, you know, we don't really doubt it, but it's worth doubting, you know. I think that whether it's progress at all, I mean, really, is there any way that we will see technological retrenchment in our life? I think it's going to be quite the opposite, don't you? I mean, what will this class look like online in 20 years when your kids are in college? I might bet it'll be some kind of hologram, right? We'll all be we'll all be holograms, and I can walk around and high five Alex's hologram. And, you know, but is that an improvement? You know, cell phones keep getting faster and smaller, but is that an improvement? I've written a book about privacy, right? Everything is surveillance. Pretty soon your self-driving car is going to be watching everything you do and anticipating every move you make everywhere you go. Why? It's like this is necessarily taken for granted as this is progress. We have to go this direction. Really? We do? Is it really better than it was? You know? Chris.
Yeah, I mean, like from this discussion, it's kind of like, you know, technology progression, but at the cost of ethics. You know, it's like being so focused on progress, you kind of like lose ethics on the way. It's like, I don't know, I'm thinking a lot about like this big conversation in art right now about NFTs. And like, yeah, technically that is progress, but like it's not ethical by
What
any.
is that? What is that? NFT?
Yeah.
What is that?
It's like a way to like for someone to permanently own digital art through like Bitcoin or something, but like they take up like a lot of like they can generate this Bitcoin, like the amount like to run a dairy farm. So it's really bad for the environment and it's really bad. Like, I don't know, all these like, you know, rich artists like tech heads are like, oh my God, NFTs are the way of the future. But it's like you're destroying the planet. Like it's not ethical.
Okay. Don't know him. Ethical is that is another concern here, of course. You know, technology has always extended the bounds of what is ethical. It's always press the envelope, right? I always say that this is nowhere better the case than in biomedical ethics. You know, biomedical development and innovation has made incredible things possible, but at the cost of what? You know, to give an extreme examples, in your generation, you may see something called designer babies, where you get to choose not only the trait, not only the physical traits, but also the emotional and or intellectual traits and talents of your child, right? And this starts out with the best of intentions, you know, and then, but who knows where it takes us, right? Again, it's just this point that we cannot take for granted that technology equals progress. This is not to say it's regress, although it might be, but it's not necessarily progress. Chris.
Yeah, I mean, like when you bring that up, it's kind of like this conversation within the, like, you know, the autistic community where
Yes.
it's, you know, like scientists and doctors have moved away from trying to cure autism to trying to detect it in the womb. And it's like, you know, like I feel like that sort of goes into what we're talking about here about social Darwinism and how that's really, really bad and wrong, but they do it under the guise of progress and like bettering. And it's basically eugenics. It's really bad.
And so let me hit on this point while it's fresh in my mind. By the way, I will make a plug for something. I get the Atlantic. I have a subscription to the Atlantic magazine, who I've also written for, plug. Anyway, but the Atlantic magazine, I get a subscription, and there was the main issue a few months ago was called The Death of Downs, or the End of Downs, the End of Down syndrome. And it's how in some countries, genetic technology has advanced so much that they're basically eradicating the existence of children with Down syndrome, so that they're not even seen. You know, those pregnancies are terminated immediately, right? That just made me think of what you said there, Chris. You know, this intolerance. Beware of this intolerance. Beware of the pressure of progress and what kind of intolerance it leads to. But what I wanted to say also is, you know, talk about this discussion we were having earlier about to what extent Darwinism and evolutionary biology is wrapped up with this issue of progress, right? As Raven was pointing out repeatedly, evolutionary biologists like to separate themselves from that because it's a touchy, difficult progress. Definitely, this is a touchy, difficult issue with some ethical catastrophes along the way. And yet, don't forget, I showed you that video last week of Mr. Dawkins. What was that about? It was about growing up. It's about humanity growing up. Is humanity grown up? Do you see signs that humanity has grown up? Or do you see signs that it is not? I'm the first to say I'm very happy living in 2021 because I don't think I'd like to live in 1421. I don't know if you heard, but they didn't have toilets back then. And that's not going to happen for this guy. No way. You know, I thank my Lord I live in this time period where I just got a vaccine for a pandemic within a year. It's remarkable. Is that a sign we've grown up? Zach?
Yeah, so what Marilynne Robinson was talking about in the reading is that like even the idea that a society can advance, that also infers like a judgment of value, because there are, you know, obviously certain detriments to living in a capitalistic society, like constantly being under stress for money, just for example, that don't exist in a, you know, quote unquote less civilized or less advanced society. Similarly, there are in what a Darwinist would describe as a less advanced society, certain diseases that there are vaccines for in what a Darwinist would call a more advanced society. So it kind of like goes both ways. It's like hard to kind of paint a holistic picture when there's so many variables that could be good or bad. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you, Zach. Do you feel it is better living now than in 1960? How about that? Anybody want to weigh in on that? Artist says, hail to the I know you weren't alive then, M. I'm just using, you guys are creatives. I was told that was my job description. You're creative, so use your imagination. How is it better living than in 1960? Go ahead, Sonny.
I may be lacking imagination, so I don't know exactly what it was like.
I doubt it.
But I do feel like it is much more easier to be moral these days. That's what I think.
It's easier to be moral.
Yeah. Oh man, I don't know. Like there are so many temptations, but I feel like they're like smaller temptations, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Like downloading illegal music, but most of us don't have like a point in our lives in which we have to like kill somebody for our own survival.
Good point. M.
I would actually disagree and say that it's harder now to be moral. And I think someone last week told you, or maybe 2 weeks ago, but told you should watch The Good Place. But
I know
you should, because this supports my argument where anyway, nobody is getting into heaven because nobody is like racking up enough like good moral points. And that's because like it is virtually impossible to be a good person under late stage capitalism, where like no matter what you do, you are contributing to a collapse of the planet. So like even if I think one example they use is like if you went to the store and bought a tomato, like that's not a bad thing to do, and like a tomato is good for you, like that should be a fine thing. But it's most likely that the tomato was farmed by someone who isn't getting paid enough for their labor, and then it was transported to the grocery store via a truck that was using fossil fuels. And like it's just every decision that you make is racked with these different consequences that you have no idea are even happening.
That's a great point, M. That's a really, really good point. You made a great point too, Sonny, and M made a really good point. These are both like, you said something I wanted to respond to, and I forget. So anyway, Chris.
Oh yeah, like I think I also agree with what M is saying, where it's like, I mean, from what I understand, from what, my grandparents and my parents have told me about the 60s or whatever, where it's like, I feel like there's a much tighter sense of community because like things are much more insular in that way. Like it's like, like as opposed to like, at least from where my parents are from, like, you didn't just go to a store and get a dress. You'd get the fabric that was made in the town from the people of the town, take it to the tailor, he would make the dress, you would have that dress. It's a very small means of production, as opposed to now where it's like, you go Forever 21, your dress is made in sweatshops that have killed like hundreds of people.
Excellent. Two things that occurred to me. I remember, when I was of that age group where when the internet was emerged, really, and became dominant. And so like your parents, I was that generation who saw we had to listen to all the evangelizers, like this is the greatest thing ever. And it is remarkable. It's probably been the most remarkable technological development in the last 20 years, for sure. What did everybody do when they got the internet? Pornography. Like how many statistics have I seen? Like half of all internet activity is porn, like, okay, great. We have Louis C.K. has great jokes about this. Like we have achieved this fantastic, remarkable development so that we can masturbate. Like, okay, right. What is the fucking problem with us? There's something wrong with us. She makes this point towards the end, and it's something that Aristotle noted, like humans are the most remarkable and remarkably good and charitable creature, and the most remarkably perverse and disgusting creature at the same time, right? The other thing I wanted to point out, and that was into what I think was Chris said a minute ago. I'm really I'm a little bit reticent to issue this criticism because I am very happy for modern medicine. Don't get me wrong. I had a kidney stone a few years ago, fucking awful. And then I was like on a whim, because I'm into torture. I looked like, how did they deal with kidney stones in the previous day? Oh, Lord and Mama. Thank God for the 21st century. Look it up. Do yourself a favor. Don't look up a porn. Look up how they used to treat kidney stones in the old days. But on the other hand, people now, people regularly live into their 90s. This is one of the reasons actually that COVID has had such a huge death mortality rates, because it is attacking the very old, because the very old are still with us. In previous generations, you would not have had so many people over 70. This is a very dangerous statement I'm going to issue. Is it an unequivocal good that we live to 90? Is that an unequivocal good, really? When I hear the tech lords in Silicon Valley talk about living to 120, they think that's doable. That's when that question occurs, like, is that an unequivocal good? What is wrong with dying at 70? And one reason I think it's not an unequivocal good is because you hear, see, I have this suspicion, y'all, and I know there are hands, I'll hand it off. I have this suspicion. We may be better off physically, but I don't think we're better off mentally. I don't think we're better off emotionally. My parents are in a retirement home. They're doing great, knock on wood. But I have, I know, and I have a friend who's a geriatrician. I know, and I've heard that, the senior citizens, they suffer very high rates of depression. There's no medicine for that yet. Will there ever be? Right? Natan, thank you very much for being patient and bearing with me. Do you still remember what you wanted to say?
I had like two things. I feel like, I remember watching reading an article, like how fast like all these social media things grew, and it was like pornography 3 days.
Yeah.
It was crazy, but
it's crazy.
It's like, yeah, well, we go to horny jail. The next thing is that, in 1960s, or like when my grandparents were younger, it was like the world was different. I want to say in these modern times, we're like more sheltered in I want to say safer in like our homes, because when my grandparents were in Morocco, someone stole his sister to marry them, and he went to save her, and he walked up to his house, broken all his fingers. So it's just like, yeah, it's crazy how much how almost it still happens, but it's not what's the word? I can't think of it. Also,
well, in many ways, things are better than they were.
Yeah.
But don't tell me, there's good reason to doubt that it's much better. Okay. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah.
I mean, I would put it this way. How much have humans really grown up? Do we exert we're not cruel, outwardly cruel, like was that your father, your grandfather? Maybe we're not so outwardly cruel like that, but maybe I wrote a book on guns. Maybe we exhibit our violence in other ways. Freud said capitalism is itself a channeling of a violent urge, where we would have in the past expressed that violence in other individuals. Now we do that through business. Yes, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, to sort of like go back to like slightly earlier in the conversation, but like I don't know, I've been doing a lot of thinking about like this certain brand of American individualism. Like obviously I would, living in 21st century as like, the person that I am is better. But you talk about mentally, like it's a lot harder mentally. And I think it is like partially because of that, like just like overt individualism, like where everything that happens to us, we feel like we have to deal by ourselves. Like like there is not a lot of like doing something for the better of the community as it is for like doing something for the better of ourselves. And that's not how humans lived for a very long time. Like two forces kind of like fighting each other there.
Excellent. Is individualism a sign of liberation? How much liberation, how liberating is it? Is it really better? Is it really superior? We take for granted in this country that individualism is one of those universal values that every democracy in the world should emulate. But it's not without its suffering and pain and suffering, right? For sure. Listen, I don't mean to, I'm not sitting here arguing that like things were better in the past, because they weren't. I'm not, and I prefer living where I am now because, as the saying goes, this is the devil, right? In a way, like I know this devil. I don't know the 14th century. I would probably be killed, as all of us would be, because we're all lefty artist types, right? So but I just think it's interesting. It's a good way. It's good to push back on this idea that humans are growing up, right? And as Dawkins would say, this idea that we are dispensing with religion is a sign that we are growing up. That is a very curious notion. I would start by doubting that we're very grown up at all. No sooner do we make innovations in technology than we do what? We learn to kill and we learn to fuck better with it, more effectively. That doesn't seem like a great sign of progress to me. The technology too often seems to be a channel that exacerbates our worst angels, our dark angels. Okay, good. Anybody else want to chime in? We've been pushing back at this idea of progress and this idea that progress is indelibly wrapped up with the idea of with evolutionary biology. Here's another way. Here's another way she critiques it. She says, this is on page 34. She says that Darwinists are unable to refrain from theology. And what she means by that is that Darwinists look at the world and they also see these overarching forces that are driving things. This may get confusing, but she says that there is a teleology in their message. This is on page 43, 44. Teleology is a Greek word. Telos equals goal. Things are driven towards a goal, right? This is the old Aristotelian Christian notion that creation, that we are driven towards goal, but it was theologically infused. We are drawn, that things are created by purpose with God, and they are driven onward to a goal by God. And Darwinism thinks that it has gotten rid of this goal-oriented account of nature and the world, but that is not exactly the case, right? Here's a quote on page 43 at the bottom. She says, and this is where she reveals the full title of the book. It does bear mentioning in this context, the full title of his first book, that is Darwin's, is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. However generously this title is interpreted, clearly it does not assume that biological systems evolve by chance and not design, as Darwin has always said to have done. It clearly implies that whatever is right, and even less tenably that whatever is the product of raw struggle, and still less tenably that there is a teleology behind it all, one which favors and preserves. Darwinists seem unable to refrain from theology as the supplanters of it. The old God may have let the rain fall on the just and the unjust alike, but this new God is more implacable in his judgments and very straightforward, killing off those who die. Right. In other words, the world we see, Darwinists are compelled to say that the world we see is good, for lack of a better word, because it is where the fittest have won out. But they don't realize the moral implications of that judgment, right? This teleology is extremely dubious and chilling. And at this point, she makes this great argument about the Irish potato famine. I see someone evoked it earlier. What does she wish to convey about the Irish potato famine? What does the Irish potato famine mean for Darwinists? What happened to the Irish potato famine, y'all?
The Irish shouldn't exist.
Damn
Survival of
straight.
the fittest, baby.
Well,
their
how
potatoes
they-
broke, they broke. Sorry about it. Top of the morning to you.
I know, right in time for St. Patrick's Day. What the hell? Okay. Well, there's more, Finn. Hang on, there's more. How were they so unfit? I mean, what actually went down in the Irish potato famine, y'all? You guys know what went down?
Wasn't it fungus?
It were. Sonny?
Oh, the fungus is super fit and should rule the world.
No.
I'm just not made to be a Darwinist. I can't do this, Furman.
It's true though.
Eat your Dove chocolate. Let's see what Sonny has to say. Sonny.
Well, what the potato famine did was that it did get rid of like the weaker Irishmen, like just how the Darwinists would interpret it, the scrawny but strong Irish people survived. But the thing is that the potatoes were the only thing that had the famine, and that was the main food of the poor people. So the crops that were too expensive for the poor people were sold to the rich people, and it kind of implies that the famine isn't the bad thing.
Well, go ahead.
Yeah, it implies that the famine isn't a bad thing. It doesn't matter if people died or not, because ultimately what the famine did was prove that the strongest were the strongest and the weak were the weak. That's Darwin's point.
Well, I see some people here in the chat. They're going down in a certain alley that is not exactly your point here. They all seem very thrilled to lauding the powers of fungus and bacteria, and you're not wrong. Like fungus and bacteria, they clearly rule. They're the bomb. But there is a little bit of a different story here in the Irish potato famine. People tend to think it is a natural disaster. A natural disaster. I have a message for y'all. The Irish potato famine was not a natural disaster. Where are my Irish people in the house? Come on. Aiden, you have a suspiciously Irish name. Irish has an Irish name, but I don't think she's from Ireland. Come on. Tell me, why was this not a natural disaster?
Didn't the British kind of prevent a lot of
health?
So what you're saying is fuck Britain.
It was the British. Were you gonna weigh in?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that there was food to eat. It's just it was not attainable by the lower classes, the farmers, because they relied on their potato crops.
Good. Ireland this is where history is important. Ireland was the breadbasket of the British Empire. They were growing all the crops to be exported. There was plenty of food in Ireland. It's just that it wasn't given to the poor Irish. They relied on the potato, and then the potato crop went bad for 4 years in a row, and so 1 million people died. So what's her point? Well, what is this? What does that story tell us about Darwinian survival of the fittest? Is that Arthur? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it just like whoever controls the resources survives, you know?
Mm-hmm. Good. Oh, M.
I kind of wrote about this in my response, I think, but like, so if the wealthy people control the resources, but they're getting those resources from the poor farmers, if all of the farmers die, then there's no one to get their resources. So then they die. So it's really kind of self-destructive.
And you don't have to be very fit to shut out half of humanity, right? You can just be a nasty, noble person. And well, I'm riffing here. And before I riff too badly, let's look at bottom 46. This is how she sums it up. She says that human beings should be thought of as better or worse animals. And human well-being as a product of culling is a willful exclusion of context. So Malthus probably looked across the Irish Sea, what was going on in Ireland. And I can tell you unfortunately, a lot of British upper class did. They looked across the sea at what was going on in Ireland. They said, this is a good thing. This is something that deserves to happen. But it is a willful ignorance of context because it's an exclusion of the political context. And she says that a willful exclusion of context seems to have remained a stable feature of Darwinian thought. Darwinian thought ignores the context, ignores the political context, and just sees some succeed and some not. And it doesn't really matter how they get there, right? So again, this is the point that the ethics that is emanating from Darwinism is really quite awful. All right, I'm just checking out the chat, making sure everything's okay. All right, good. All good? I feel like I've been editorializing a lot today, so I apologize. My mother's from Ireland, so sometimes I might be apt to say things about British people. I should be careful. The British.
Literally, every time I see a British person, I'm like, get well soon.
Good, right. And of course, I think, her thinking, it's an interesting application of Darwinian theory in a way that it could be applied to any of the colonial stories in America, in interesting ways. She suggests as much at a certain point, like so-called primitive societies, native societies in Americas, they were perfectly healthy, they were perfectly fine and thriving. And you could argue we have greatly impoverished for having lost them, But anyway, let's talk about Christianity again, because she tells us on 48, she says that this is a little bit of a unique claim, a little bit of a surprising claim to you, perhaps. She says that what principally sparked Darwinism, what principally sparked it in the middle of the 1800s, was a fatigue and a rejection of Christian ethics. She says it arose from rather than ended in a critique of ethical systems. Darwinism really was reacting to Christian ethics. It's a rebellion against the Judeo-Christian tradition. How so? How is Darwinism a reaction to or rebellion against Christianity?
I'm so sorry I didn't raise my hand, but I think it's like what Zach was going in on earlier that I also elaborated on with like the whole people being sick of just being good. Like they just want to be bad because being good they haven't felt the benefits. Being good isn't supported in the societies that we've established, and like capitalism and all that fun stuff we talked about. Like being a good person isn't supported by it. Donation, charity is not sustainable for an individual. It comes out of the kindness of your heart. So there's no real benefit besides peace of mind. And the issue that I think that a lot of religion brings up is that religious doctrines teach you should be charitable, you should be kind, you shouldn't be a bad person. But Darwinism gave people this excuse that like, oh, I need to survive. I need to feed my family before I can think about feeding someone else's family. And then hiding behind that, that's that privilege of being able to not look at the homeless people sleeping on the street and being able to ignore disenfranchised people and all that fun stuff. But Furman, are you okay? What's going on there?
No, I like it. I like what I'm hearing.
Okay, you were dancing a little. It was so cute.
I'm nodding.
Okay, party. Yeah.
It's good. It's good. I like it.
But yeah, I think that relationship is just what Darwinism, like it completely divorces like morality from your life, like in an excusable way.
A specific morality, and you hit on those themes. You hit on them, and I like you nailed it. You pointed out like where Christianity runs afoul or is a pain in the butt for capitalism, right? That's where it has to be, nudged aside. Yes, Chris.
Yeah, I think like part of the issue that Finn also just touched on is that like you have this unsustainable model because like no one is putting forth solutions to actually fix the problem. So the problem, like the solution is placed on individuals who obviously can't sustain that. And then so you have like this never-ending problem, this like never-ending issue of like people who are homeless, who are in poverty, who are ill, and all that. It's never-ending.
Good. I think Tobias hit it on the nose here earlier. Tobias said, "Aren't you tired of being nice? Don't you want to just go ape shit?" Yeah, morality is a pain, man, right? It gets in the way. Christianity in particular. I mean, what aspect? We were talking about this last week about Jim Webb and Sojourners, which is is an institution he runs in Washington. It's a left-wing evangelical group. I mean, what aspect of the gospel has routinely been ignored? The insistence that you elevate the poor. That has routinely been ignored over and over and over again. Why is that? Because it's not convenient, right? And here I'm going to tie in a point with what Finn said a minute ago, putting this in the chat. Capitalism had to get rid of Christian charity. This was not going to work. This is her argument. I'm just telling you her argument. I'm not sure how much I endorse it. I'd like to hear if you all agree with it or what you think. But her argument is early capitalism had to get rid of Christian charity. This was not going to happen. The exploitation that follows with capitalism simply is at odds with the gospel. I mean, let's be honest. Jesus is a Marxist. It's pretty clear if you read the Gospel of Matthew. There's really no other way around it. I'm sorry. People have been trying to explain it away for centuries. And every time I read the Gospel of Matthew, it's pretty clear. It's just pretty clear. And he tells you not to judge. He tells you not to throw the first stone. He tells you to turn the other cheek. He is nothing but clear. And yet this just will not work with capitalist economics. And so her theory is that Darwinism seized upon this reaction to, this fatigue with Christian ethics and ran with it. And her two big points of evidence are Freud and Nietzsche, who I'll talk about in a second. But let me see if anybody has anything they want to weigh in on here. I see we have some comrades. Anybody want to weigh in? Anybody want to weigh in on her interpretation of history there? I was thinking about this before class. You hear about early colonial imperialists, at least European imperialists. They wrap Christianity into their mission, right? Not the values necessarily, but they say, you know, we're Christianizing people as the same time we're conquering. You don't see capitalism do that. Capitalism very rarely, except in America, for some reason. Capitalism very rarely tries to give itself a Christian justification. There is this thing in America, and only in America that I know of, called the prosperity gospel. You guys ever heard of this? Anybody know what the prosperity gospel? And here, this is no joke. This is totally serious. One of the preachers who's the main proponents of it, his name is Crespo T. Dollar. Scout's honor. That's a great name, by the way. If you have a kid, you should definitely call him or her Crespo T. Dollar. But the prosperity, I don't know, Em, you asked me the impossible. But the prosperity gospel is this strange thing. There's exactly one passage in the gospel that they point to where they argue that God wants us to be rich. Oh, yes, Rebecca did mention this before. I think she did, yeah. And it is popular in America because, I guess this is the attempt of the evangelicals to justify and appropriate capitalism. But for the most part, capitalism is unabashedly and nakedly secular. So anyway, here is a quote on page 48 about where she talks about how Darwinism, you know, its principal point of departure from God, from religion, was its objection to Christian ethics. This is the middle of 48. To be free of God, the creator, is to be free of the religious ethic implied in the Genesis narrative of creation. Charity was the shadow of a gesture toward acknowledging the obligations of human beings to one another. Thus conceived, it was a burden under which people never stopped chafing. Witness this unfathomably rich country now, America, now contriving new means daily to impoverish the poor among us. I'm going to ask a little dangerous question here. Do we still read Ayn Rand? That used to be a thing for teenagers. Ayn Rand. Well, Ayn Rand is a very popular fiction writer who was a virulent capitalist, staunch capitalist. And she has also become like this stealth inspiration for many factions, many people in our government, typically on the right. Paul Ryan, Clarence Thomas, a lot of people have been very inspired by her. And if y'all don't know her, then I really won't riff on her too much, but I would just say, like, she unabashedly points out that Christianity is a liability, and that Christian charity is the problem, and selfishness and greed are goods, and that's what capitalism empowers. And you will have losers. You will have losers, and the losers need to be left behind, and the strong need to be elevated. And it's I've written about her ethic a couple times, largely because to point out how pervasive and popular it is. When I was your age, everybody was reading Ayn Rand. And it's shocking how many people in power today are still motivated by that outlook. Paul Ryan, actually, he was the Speaker of the House of Representatives 2 years ago. And he reportedly, he had everybody on his staff read Ayn Rand because he thought that was so important. But it was a very cruel, and it's the worst of, Chris, I'm from the 80s. Come on now. It's the worst of, Ayn Rand is the worst of Darwinism, of Darwinist and capitalist thinking. You know, it's really where they converge. Anyway, I'm blabbing here. Let me move on to, I want to cover two more things before we break for the day. And this is the point, let's get to the point that Raven was bringing up earlier, which is, you know, one of the unsavory things about Darwinian thinking, where it overlaps with capitalism, by the way, and is also a kind of limiting feature, is the way it dwells on selfishness, right? Dawkins, one of his principal books is called The Selfish Gene, right? She says that association is really hard for Darwinians to explain. They insist on the overriding drive and demand of selfishness. But she thinks that, you know, observing ordinary human behavior defies or rebuts this, you know, this idea that we are predominantly, essentially, or principally selfish. So let's get into this issue here. How do Darwinians try to explain social behavior? Chris?
So it's basically like every one of our traits is basically like innately self-serving. So things like generosity and kindness are deep down just like self-serving traits for our survival, as opposed to like genuine care and compassion for other people.
Good. Awesome. Anybody else want to supplement what she says? How do Darwinians explain social behavior? Sunny?
Oh, I think she says that they make a differentiation between like individual personal survival and group survival. Yeah, so like those benevolent and charitable traits would help the survival of the group of the species as a whole rather than the individual.
Okay. Good. Yes. And that's kind of like, that's where they that's that tension that they have a hard time bridging. How about this question? How do Darwinists explain love? What is love? I'm seeing provocative suggestions in the chat, but I need more. I need explanations. M, give it to me straight.
um, sorry, yeah, I'm laughing at the chat. Well, I know she says that like love for your family is basically uh it's our need to like monitor the people who will continue our line of survival, the people who will be related to us, and hope that they will continue to reproduce. But then I also wanted to bring up that I think she talks a lot about how like empathy and compassion and generosity are considered unnatural to Darwinists.
Nice. And that's a big problem, right? It's unnatural because we're at bottom, we're selfish. So if it's unnatural, then how the hell do you explain it, right? It's very difficult. So excellent. Good. Chris, yeah.
She also mentioned how Darwinists will like want to like eliminate like their families like rivals, especially in terms of like, you know, like all that stuff. So like try and like weed out what might be in the way of their survival.
Right. Yes, I think you're alluding to the quote I wanted to read. This is the top of 51. She quotes this guy, Robert Wright. And top of 51, Wright goes on to say, as Darwinists do, that we are kind to our kin. This is kind of what Emma was getting into. You have families, you have friends, you have family and children. Why are you nice to your parents? Why are you nice to your kids and brothers? We're kind to our kin, those custodians of our genetic immortality. Why do you love the people in your family? Genetic immortality. Yeah, M, good point. I don't have an answer for that. He goes on, this is top, she goes on 51, she's quoting him. This finickiness gives finickiness, right? That I love my kids as opposed to the others because my kids are the custodians of my genetic immortality. This is finicky. I'm just finicky. Fuck you. This finickiness gives our moral sentiments a naturally seamy underside. Beneath familial love, for example, is a malice towards our relatives' rivals. What the hell? Like, I'm on the verge of driving over my neighbor's kids because they're the rivals of my own. So our beguiling attributes can be reduced to this little meanness that governs all. That's her point, right? Right, Arthur. This is an interesting research project, by the way. If anybody here thinks that like these are extreme cases here, this is an extreme example of how Darwinists have trouble talking about love. I urge you, look at the research. You won't find, you know, they have, it is a problem. They have a hard time describing love. You know, the maternal bond, right? When or if you have a child, you know, you might hear about the maternal bond. It seems to be much stronger than having to do with genetic immortality. You know, am I really motivated by my own genetic immortality? Is that really it? I really want to see this hairline go down in history. Is that really it? I mean, I don't know. One last point, and then we can break here. There's an even better quote. Em was evoking this, talking about empathy. She has a great quote about someone who tries to explain charity, right? And this is the bottom of 51. This is also right. Wright says, this guy's troubled. Wright says that when we send money to help victims of a famine on another continent, our equipment of reciprocal altruism is being fooled by electronic technology, like the TV, if we see pictures of the poor, into unconsciously thinking that the victims of famine are right next door and might someday reciprocate. You get it? Why did we give money to victims of a famine halfway across the world, Arthur?
I feel like that says a lot more about the Darwinists than it says about humanity, and like how they think of that everything comes with a price, like to them, and how they can't really think beyond themselves in that way. You know, like they won't do something if it doesn't benefit them. Like that more speaks about how they think, I think, than how humanity as a whole, like the different kinds of thinking that occurs.
They have nothing, they have no account for altruism. They have
Yeah.
nothing to say. They can't.
Yeah, I just think that shows that they don't have compassion as opposed to everyone else.
They're, what Robinson would say, thank you, Arthur, is that they are willfully ignoring it. And why? Because of their impatience with the Christian ethic. You know, but it is definitely an impressive feat of mental acrobatics that they undergo here, right? To say, like, why are you giving money to the victims of that flood in Africa? Well, literally what the guy said is the TV is beaming the picture into your bedroom, so you think that you're somehow tricked that they're next door, and that your own survival is dependent on reciprocal donation if or when you are hit with a flood. That doesn't seem very scientific. First of all, that's her other point, right? This is an interesting claim she levels over and over again, that Darwinism is not as scientific as they suggest, right? They leap to judgments, and they don't pay attention to evidence. That's the first thing Dawkins said over and over again. We only pay attention to evidence. Then pay attention to the evidence. Pay attention to the evidence. You're not. You're making the evidence fit your theory. Okay. Good. All right. Anybody else want to weigh in here on love and altruism? Anything she's overlooking? Maybe anybody thinks she's not being fair. Sunny.
Oh yeah, sorry. Just to build on Arthur's point about how this theory says more about the Darwinists rather than humanity. Marilynne does say something about there's no such thing as unnatural if natural is all that there is in the world, as the Darwinists say. So in turn, yeah, when the Darwinists say that charity and like altruism, these things are natural characteristics of humanity, and the Darwinists actually trying to deny it in itself is actually natural. So she kind of turns the argument on its head.
Very good. Yes, and the thought that occurs to me is, you know, M reminds us, you know, that altruism is unnatural. Love is unnatural. Okay. Thanks for the information. Are you issuing a covert judgment statement here? I mean, should I strive to be natural in that case? I think I'll strive to be unnatural. So, good. Anybody else want to weigh in? All right, Em, that's right. Let's be unnatural. You never hear that you never see that on a bumper sticker, but you guys can start. Anyway, I think I'm going to let you all go and enjoy the outdoors where I am at 60 degrees. So I'm going to go outside for a little bit. So I'll stick around if anybody needs to chat. Otherwise, I will see you all next week. Okay. All right. So next week, just a reminder, you have 2 more essays by Marilynne Robinson, and I hope to have all your papers by then. Okay. All righty. See you later. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank everybody.
Thanks, Vermin. Have a good one.